Welcome to the third episode of Preserving the Republic, a dialogue. I'm your host, Aaron, and today I'm unpacking three more traits of fascism: rampant sexism, manipulation of mass media, and an obsession with national security. And I'll explain how these traits align with the ideology and actions of Donald Trump. I'll start with instances of Trump's personal sexism, from public insults to allegations of harassment, and his administration's policy changes that have harmed women. Next, I'll explore media control that includes Trump's attacks on journalists, his efforts to silence critics in general, and his efforts to spread distrust to shape public perception. Then I'll examine militarization, which includes the expansion of government enforcement agencies, record-breaking defense budgets, and the politicization of the armed forces. Finally, I'll discuss a fourth factor, which is not a fascist trait itself, that explains why everyday people can be inclined to support authoritarian leaders. To start, the fifth aspect of a fascist government or a fascist political point of view is rampant sexism, misogyny, and a general hatred towards women. Trump personally has made multiple sexist comments over the years. The first example happened relatively recently when Bloomberg reporter Catherine Lucy asked President Trump a question about the Epstein files. Of course, Trump is naturally going to be upset because he didn't want to release the Epstein files at first, even though he eventually signed a law releasing them. But his response to the reporter was just to say, "Quiet, quiet, piggy." He would never say something like that to a man. The second example relates to Alicia Mercado, who won the Miss Universe pageant in 1996. Trump at the time owned the pageant, and Trump made a comment to Alicia, calling her Miss Piggy, and told her to lose weight. That's kind of ironic considering the size that he currently is. The third example relates to a New York Times correspondent, Katie Rogers, where he called her third-rate and ugly, both inside and out. The fourth example happened in 2018, where he called Omarosa Newman, who was a former contestant on The Apprentice and a former White House aide, a dog, and a lying lowlife. The fifth example relates to how Trump has referred to Stormy Daniels. Now, for reference, Stormy Daniels was an adult film actress who claimed that she had a sexual encounter with Mr. Trump. And in response to these allegations, Trump called her horseface. Trump has made efforts to deny the allegations, which is fine. He has every right to do so, and has heavily denied Daniels' allegations. But in this effort, he and people that work for him falsified business records, which eventually led to Trump being convicted on 34 felony counts. Now, Trump is still trying to get the convictions thrown out, but the reality is that he was convicted. It doesn't prove that Daniel's allegations are correct, but his response to her and his efforts to illegally change business records signals why he was targeting Daniels and making sexist comments towards her. I think it's important to understand the context of this as well. Historically and currently, Trump seems to lash out at anyone who questions or opposes anything that he says. Really, anyone who doesn't promote him as being a almost godlike figure. But his comments to women are consistently different, and it signals the underlying sexism or sexist views that he holds. There have also been multiple instances where women have accused Trump of sexual assault or sexual harassment. The names of his accusers include Kristen Anderson, E. Jean Carroll, Rachel Crooks, Jane Doe, aka Katie Johnson, who is related to the Epstein files, Jessica Drake, Jill Harth, Kathy Heller, Nini Lakosin, Jessica Leeds, Mindy McGilfray, Jennifer Murphy, Cassandra Searless, Natasha Stonehoff, Temple Taggart McDowell, Karina Virginia, and Summer Servos. And these are just a few of the names that I managed to find while doing research for this episode. Trump has also been accused of walking in the dressing room of a beauty pageant where contestants included Mariah Bilodeau, Tasha Dixon, Victoria Hughes, and Bridget Sullivan. Now, I think it's important to be mindful that these are accusations. These are not proof that Trump has actually behaved in this way. It's not enough proof to bring charges against him, and it's certainly not enough proof to convict him in a court of law. That being said, women don't usually lie about what's happened to them when it comes to sexual assault. In fact, it's the very opposite. Women typically don't talk about what's happened because there's a stigma. Even today, where the culture has shifted dramatically, there's still a stigma for women speaking out and talking about what happened to them. I think that these accusations should be taken seriously, and it's an indicator of the way that Trump behaves around women. Finally, I want to talk about an incident where Trump basically grabbed about sexually assaulting women. And I think this is the strongest bit of evidence that shows that Trump doesn't care about consent when it comes to his interactions with women. Of course, I'm referring to the grab them by the P word comment that he made. I want to read the full context of what he said. Trump's full quote was, "Yeah, that's her with the gold. I better use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. Just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the P word. You can do anything." This signals that the other accusations are more than likely being more close to accurate, because his behavior towards the women in his life probably reflects the way that he talked in that moment, especially considering he did not realize that he was being recorded. Another example of how the Trump administration and Trump himself is sexist are the Epstein files. Now, I've briefly alluded to this earlier, but I want to go into some of the deeper details now. So for background, Trump really doesn't want the Epstein files to be released, and he's made every effort to prevent the release of the files where he's associated or included or listed. The first example of how the Epstein files show how Trump is sexist is that Trump is suing the Wall Street Journal about an Epstein-related story. That story covered Trump's relationship with Epstein and included a lewd birthday card allegedly sent by Trump to Epstein. Trump is basically suing the Wall Street Journal because he says that these comments are completely false. And while it's important to note that these are allegations, it still fits with his consistent behavior historically. Trump has also repeatedly claimed that the Epstein files are a conspiracy against him, that it's this grand hoax. In essence, it's a way to politically attack him. And while true, his being in the Epstein files does politically hurt him, these are all files that have been collected by law enforcement, the judicial department, and so I would say that these files are accurate, regardless of whether or not what Trump says. It would take a grand conspiracy of many, many, many people to lie about something like that. According to NPR, Trump called those who question the narrative around Epstein's death and are calling for more transparency stupid and foolish. Now, just briefly, I want to talk about the conspiracy around Epstein's death. I know that that's a view that's relatively popular in popular culture, that Epstein's death was not a suicide. I think it's important to logically think about what has happened and understand that there's no direct evidence that shows that Epstein's death was anything other than a suicide. And therefore, the conspiracy theories saying that his death was not a suicide shouldn't be taken seriously until direct evidence is brought forth proving that his death was a murder. Doesn't mean that his death wasn't necessarily a murder, but you have no proof, and without proof, you cannot make sound conclusions. The Trump administration has also fought against the law passed by Congress requiring the release of the Epstein files. In fact, it wasn't until after it was clear that Congress, with the Republican majorities, was going to pass the law that he changed his tone and suddenly decided to support the release of the Epstein files. That change in tone and support led to the law passing nearly unanimously. Despite the law saying that the Epstein files generally need to be released, there are some exceptions. For example, redacting victim names or preventing the release of files that have active investigations open. But, in general, the Justice Department is supposed to release all of the Epstein files in a timely manner. As of February 25th, 2026, the Justice Department is investigating files that were not released that do mention Trump by name. Specifically, there are FBI interviews with a woman who made allegations against Trump. Now, there were other instances like this included, but this is an instance where the file was not released. Withholding this file directly violates federal law. And ironically, because victims' names and other identifying information had been released when they weren't supposed to, they were supposed to be redacted, as I mentioned earlier, it seems fishy. Now again, this doesn't prove that Trump is actively taking this one file to prevent its release. In fact, I think it's far more likely that this is just an administrative error, but that doesn't mean that the Trump administration wouldn't prefer for this information not to be released. And the Trump administration certainly is putting pressure on the Justice Department to do what Trump prefers and wants. Trump has publicly talked about how the Epstein files are a distraction. Trump said, quote, "What this whole thing is with Epstein is a way of trying to deflect from the tremendous success the Republican Party has," end quote. Again, the Epstein files shouldn't matter because Trump and the current Republican Party have done so many good things that we should ignore the horrible, horrible things that powerful men have done to children. Speaking of powerful men, Trump has defended the men and women who are powerful and wealthy that are in the files. Trump has said, quote, "You probably have pictures being exposed of other people that innocently met Jeffrey Epstein years ago, many years ago. And there, you know, highly respected bankers and lawyers and others," end quote. Now I want to talk about how an association with Epstein doesn't necessarily mean that someone knew of Epstein's crimes or participated. And the context behind the names that are released matters quite a bit. But it seems to me he is more protective of powerful people than the victims. As I said earlier, inclusion in the files does not equal guilt. And in fact, if there was enough evidence to charge the people that are listed in the Epstein files, the Justice Department would have done so already. But a court of law is different from moral judgment. Just because there's not enough evidence for someone to be convicted doesn't mean that the information in the Epstein files isn't enough to judge character. In my opinion, everyone involved needs to be held accountable to the fullest extent possible. It doesn't matter if someone's a Democrat or Republican, they should be held accountable. A notable name that is in the Epstein files is Bill Clinton. An additional example of how the Trump administration is sexist is its support for certain laws and policies that are sexist in nature. And the first example I want to talk about is the SAVE Act, or as it's also known, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. This act was passed by the House, but as of today, as of this recording, the Senate has yet to pass it. And part of the requirements of this bill includes requiring citizenship documents in order for a person to register to vote. For example, having a passport or a birth certificate. And on its face, that sounds like a good thing, given that citizens are the only ones who can vote and have the right to vote in federal elections, why not require documentation that proves you're a citizen? After all, we want to prevent fraudulent voting. The problem is that widespread voting fraud really isn't a problem, and non-citizens voting is already illegal. The other issue with the SAVE Act is that married women and other Americans who have changed their names would be required to secure updated documentation to register to vote. Men typically don't change their last names. It does happen, but they don't typically change their last names. But married women do. And if there's a mismatch between what the married women's name shows and what their documentation shows, they would be stopped from voting, even if they were citizens and were fully eligible to vote. The SAVE Act also has other issues because acquiring a passport is costly. It's around $180. That's not an exact figure, but it does cost a decent chunk of change. And many Americans don't even have passports. And so really the SAVE Act is really an effort at voter suppression, not fraud prevention, which dramatically would impact women's ability to vote. Another example includes Trump's efforts to freeze funding under Title X, which provides funding for reproductive health care. Now, I'm intentionally ignoring and not mentioning the abortion issue because I prefer to give the benefit of the doubt to people who are pro-life. I think that they legitimately believe that a fertilized egg is human life. And so if you do legitimately believe that, then opposing legal abortion would make sense. I don't think that people who are pro-life are inherently sexist. But Title X does not fund abortion. Rather, Title X pays for birth control, certain cancer screenings, and STI testing. All things that impact all women. You can even ignore the aspects that relate to sexual health. Cancer screenings alone impact women in a way that don't impact men. At least cancer screenings related to reproductive health. In addition, President Trump signed an executive order ending disparate impact liability from civil rights enforcement. And this is diving a little bit into the legal weeds, and I am not a lawyer, but I'll do my best to provide a brief overview. In 1971, the Supreme Court made a landmark ruling in a case called Griggs versus Duke Power Company. And so for background, this power company basically set criteria that had nothing to do with job performance, but that negatively impacted the evaluation of Black job applicants. And as such, the company basically did not hire or hired fewer African Americans. And the question before the court was, did this violate civil rights law? And the court decided that it did. In that ruling, the court basically said that even if, quote, there's not overt discrimination, that practices that are fair in form but discriminatory in operation are also illegal. In other words, even if you don't explicitly say you're going to discriminate against a minority group, it can still violate civil rights law. And there's an important caveat to their ruling as well, and that there must be a robust casualty requirement. In other words, you can't just show a statistical imbalance. A hypothetical example is if 95% of oil rig workers are men, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's disparate impact. Rather than there just being an imbalance for whatever reason, you have to tie this imbalance to a specific hiring practice. For example, let's just say an employer says that they will only hire applicants that are taller than 6 foot. On average, more men than women are able to meet this requirement. But the job that the employer is looking for has nothing to do with height, and height has nothing to do with the performance of the job. Let's just say in this hypothetical example that it's a law firm looking to hire lawyers. In this case, disparate impact would show a violation of civil rights, and women would be harmed in this instance. But because Trump has signed an executive order ending disparate impact liability from civil rights enforcement, it means that current civil rights laws, where discriminatory impacts happen won't be enforced. As a result, women and other minority groups will be harmed. He's essentially saying that unless an employer explicitly says that they will not hire women, that the civil rights laws won't be enforced to protect those women. And of course, this doesn't just hurt women, it also hurts other minority groups. But this executive order proves that Trump supports sexist policies that harm women. The sixth trait of fascism, or a fascist government, is direct control by that government of mass media. Now, I think it's fair to say that this is probably the weakest link when it comes to connecting the Trump administration with fascism, in the sense that there's not a direct government-run media operation that supports the Trump administration in a similar way that Russian or Chinese state media operate to support their governments. But Trump does regularly attack the media and journalists in order to sow distrust and distort the role that the media has in an open society. The media and journalists in general are the fourth estate in our democracy. Now, for those that don't know, there's three branches of government in the United States: legislative, judicial, and executive. But the Founding Fathers also talked about the importance of having newspapers and journalism, in the sense that they keep leaders accountable to their citizens. And that's why it's known as the Fourth Estate. And it's also one of the major reasons why the First Amendment included the protection of journalists and of free speech. Of course, there's always problems and biases with the media. There always have been, and there always will be. But despite those flaws, the media plays an important role in a free society. And I want to pause here and just say that protection of the media and journalists applies to all outlets, even those that don't politically align with my own views. Fox News, Newsmax, just to name a couple of different examples, should be protected under the government, not attacked, even though I strongly disagree with their opinions and with the way that they cover some of the stories that they broadcast. It doesn't matter. It should be protected. But Trump doesn't have that view. Trump has sued multiple media outlets, including ABC News, CBS News is 60 Minutes segment, the Associated Press. He has sued the New York Times for $15 billion for defamation. And speaking more specifically to the New York Times example, Trump has said, quote, "The Times has engaged in a decades-long method of lying about your favorite president, me, my family, business, the American First Movement, MAGA, and our nation as a whole. I am proud to hold this once respected rag responsible." In other words, he's bragging about suing the New York Times, which again certainly has its biases. It's probably left-wing more than right-wing in my opinion, but they're still a news organization. Of note, none of these lawsuits have actually gone to court. ABC News and CBS settled their lawsuits, but to me this screams more of corruption than it does that Trump was right in suing these media organizations. Lawsuits are costly. Even if you go to court and you are on the right side, lawsuits are costly. And so it's often easier to settle out of court rather than going through the court system to promote your side. So rather than going to court, it's just easier to pay Trump some hush money and go on with life. Really, lawsuits from the Trump administration have been designed to silence critics more than it is to actually sue for legitimate damages. Another significant example of how the Trump administration is attacking journalists includes the arrests of two independent journalists, former CNN reporter Don Lemon and Georgia Fort. I'm not as familiar with the coverage that Georgia Fort produces in her independent coverage, but I am more familiar with Don Lemon, and he certainly has a liberal bias. Anyone who's honest wouldn't deny that. For background, the reason why these two journalists were arrested was because they were covering a protest at a Minnesota church where protesters were fighting against, or protesting against, government immigration enforcement actions. These protesters entered the church during an active religious service and started chanting "ICE out" and "Justice for Renee Good." The reason why the protesters targeted this church is that one of its pastors, David Easterwood, leads ICE's St. Paul field office. Lemon was acting in his capacity as a journalist. In fact, during his live stream coverage, he said, "I'm not here as an activist, I'm here as a journalist." He also interviewed protesters and church attendants. Of note, a magistrate judge in Minnesota previously declined to sign off on the charges against him. And so this isn't about Don Lemon trespassing on church property or violating the church's First Amendment right to practice their religion as they see fit. And I'm not making an argument that the protesters shouldn't have been arrested. They did trespass, they interrupted a church service, and they refused to leave. Those are all arrestable offenses. But Don Lemon specifically, in his capacity of creating news as an independent journalist, should have never been arrested and should have never been charged. And Georgia Fort was arrested and charged for similar reasons. I believe that Georgia Fort and Don Lemon were targeted by the Trump administration because they don't like the news that they report, and they don't like that their reporting has a liberal bias. And that is inherently anti-democratic and anti-American. Another example of how the Trump administration has attacked the media includes a concerning incident that happened with Jimmy Kimmel. He's not a journalist, but he is a pretty well-known comedian that is known for criticizing Trump. On his show, Jimmy Kimmel, in reference to the Charlie Kirk assassination, quote, "The MAGA gang is desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them, and doing everything they can to score political points from it." In my opinion, at the time it was far too early to assign specific political viewpoints to the shooter. Republicans around this time also assigned blame to the shooter as being a radical leftist who targeted Charlie Kirk intentionally because of Charlie Kirk's political views. Now, this doesn't mean that the shooting wasn't politically motivated, but assigning blame before you know all the facts is a mistake. I think it's important to pause during traumatic moments like the Kirk murder because they are traumatic moments. And again, it's important to evaluate the evidence independently and to not make assumptions. Kirk was not a political figure in the sense that he did not hold public office, but nonetheless, Kirk was a political figure on the conservative side of the spectrum. And while assassinations of political figures are often political in nature, or there are political motives behind the assassination, that doesn't mean that assassinations of political figures are always politically motivated. A really good example of this is when there was an attempt to shoot Reagan, and in that case, there was no political motivation. Rather, the shooter had severe mental illness, and because of his mental illness, ended up attempting to assassinate the president of the United States at the time. And so after Kimmel said what he said, Brendan Carr, the FCC chair, threatened ABC's affiliate licenses if Disney did not take action against the host. As a result, Disney suspended Kimmel immediately and indefinitely. In addition, Nexstar, which is a company that owns a large subset of local ABC stations, pulled the show. Nexstar needed approval for a merger from the FCC. In essence, this is a scenario where the government says that a figure shouldn't make political statements. Now, again, I disagree with the way that Kimmel made his point, but the reality is the government should have no say in the way that someone makes a political point. They should be completely independent in order to promote free speech. And there are very rare circumstances where, yes, the government can interfere with free speech. The classic example that many people quote is that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. But in this instance, it's very obvious that Jimmy Kimmel was not calling for violent actions by his viewers. And whether or not Jimmy Kimmel's show should continue to air or not is besides the point. If someone, anyone, Kimmel or otherwise, publicly espouses views that you don't agree with or that you think are vile, there's a simple solution that doesn't require any government intervention. Turn off the TV. Don't watch. Don't listen. Inevitably, public figure shows, like Jimmy Kimmel's, will be canceled if people refuse to watch. There's no need to have a government intervene to stop aspects of speech that they don't like. There's a second example I want to talk about where the Trump administration has targeted a comedian, and that example is The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Recently, Stephen Colbert interviewed James Tallarico, who is running or was running to be the Democratic nominee for the U.S. Senate from Texas. He is now the Democratic official nominee to run for Senate in Texas. CBS, which is the channel that Colbert hosts his show on, told Colbert that he could not air the interview on TV given the Trump administration's enforcement of the equal time rule. Colbert said, quote, in reference to Tallarico, he was supposed to be here, but we were told in no uncertain terms by our network's lawyers who called us directly that we could not have him on the broadcast, end quote. CBS later clarified that they provided legal guidance that the broadcast could trigger the FCC equal time rule for two other candidates and presented options for how the equal time for other candidates could be filled. Ultimately, CBS decided to air the interview on YouTube rather than through the public airways. For context on why this is so concerning, it's important to understand what this equal time rule actually is. The Equal Time Rule was part of the Communication Act of 1934, so it's a public law that applies to public airways. It says that if a station gives airtime to one candidate, then the same station must offer comparable time to other candidates competing in a given contest, should they ask for it. And so for historical context, there were far fewer radio stations or TV stations in 1934. And so the rule was put in place out of a sense of having an informed public. If there's only a set few media stations that can publicly broadcast interviews with candidates, then if one radio station decides not to air an interview with different candidates, it could sway the outcome of an election. And so logically, it might make sense to have this type of rule. Traditionally, talk shows have been exempt from this rule. Because Colbert hosts a talk show, in the past, this rule would have never been applied to him. But the current FCC chairman, Brendan Carr, has questioned the talk show exemption and basically has said that often talk shows are motivated by partisan influences. He said, quote, the FCC has not been presented with any evidence that the interview portion of any late night or daytime television talk show program on air presently would qualify for the bona fide news exemption. And so it's clear that even though the application of the equal time rule is the literal enforcement of what the law says, that doesn't mean that enforcement of that rule makes any sense to do today. In today's environment, this podcast is a perfect example. Everyone has access and ability, for the most part, to say and publish what they say in any format that they desire to do. And because of that, there's not as big of a concern with a single media outlet controlling the way that people are able to broadcast their views to the world. And yet the current FCC chairman is still promoting the enforcement of this rule, not out of the sense of preserving democratic debate in a free society, but rather because Colbert is viewed as being too liberal and therefore should be taken off the air. And that's a scenario that anyone who supports democracy should be terrified of. The seventh trait of fascism is an obsession with national security. Now, naturally, this includes the military, but the Trump administration has also created a new hyper-focus on border security in order to stop drug smuggling, and would classify that into the obsession with national security. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, which the Trump administration refers to as the Department of War, side note, The real name is U.S. Department of Defense, and until Congress changes it, it will still be the Department of Defense. But they said, quote, on his first day in office, Trump issued an executive order designating Mexican cartels and transnational criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations, elevating them to the same threat level as ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Now, I have some major concerns with this classification because there's a difference between criminal activity and war. War implies that there's military action and there's fighting on two different sides. But Trump's classifying these cartels as terrorist organizations, and yes, the cartels are extremely violent, but they're not a nation state, nor do they control a nation state. Now, you could argue that there's issues with corruption and that they indirectly maybe control some South American countries, but they don't directly control any government in the same way that Al-Qaeda or ISIS has. And yet they're still being classified as global foreign terrorist organizations, which essentially expands the scope of reasons for the United States to take military action. A really good example of this is the actions the Trump administration took in Venezuela. I want to note and highlight why the Trump administration renamed the Department of Defense to the Department of War. I think it's an important rhetorical shift towards aggression, i.e., the military are fighters, not defenders. And of course, as I alluded to just moments ago, this is just another example of the executive branch trying to take power away from Congress. I want to note a speech that Hegoth gave to the top military leaders, where he basically accused the Department of Defense of lowering standards due to public pressure. And he called the Department of Defense the woke department, who had toxic leaders. This speech wasn't just about expanding anti-DEI policies into the military. Hegoth also spoke to the demonization of the military, and he, in essence, wants the military to return to their manly roots. But again, it's about more than just creating this highly masculine fighting force. It's also about expanding the role of the military and using the military in order to promote national security, which on its face isn't a bad thing, but they're shifting the military to become more of a political force as well. Trump also spoke during the same event, saying, quote, I signed an executive order to provide training for a quick reaction force that can help quell civil disturbances. This is going to be a big thing for the people in this room because it's the enemy from within, and we have to handle it before it gets out of control. It won't get out of control. Again, this signals the politicization of the military, and so it shifts the role of national defense and national security from protecting the United States from foreign enemies to fighting against Trump's political enemies. And he's already implemented or used the military in this way by sending troops into various cities, including Los Angeles and most notably Washington, D.C. Trump hasn't been swayed from giving politically motivated speeches to the military in other circumstances. Now, in the past, he's mostly spoken to everyday lower-level military members where he's attacked Democrats, and he's essentially tried to convince the military to support him. I think that's a huge danger and warning sign for American democracy because it signals that the military, or at least that Trump wants the military, to attack his political enemies. I want to raise the question, what happens if the military is more significantly deployed against Trump's political enemies? What does that mean? Well, in essence, it would signal the end of American democracy. Another way that the Trump administration is obsessed with national security is that they are supporting extremely high levels of military funding. In 2026, Trump is allocating $1 trillion to the military, which is record high spending for the United States. This is a 13.4% increase from 2025. And I think it's important to note that the United States already has had an extremely high military budget compared to the rest of the world, and that this high spending and funding has occurred under Democrats and Republican administrations. I still think that this increase in funding, though, is extremely concerning especially with the increase in rhetoric to fight against political enemies using the military, or at least that's implied. In addition, the Republican Congress also set aside roughly $170 billion for immigration enforcement and border security efforts. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has received a record budget increase, with its annual funding rising from $8.7 billion to $27.7 billion, roughly a 3 times increase. And Congress has also allocated $75 billion to ICE over the next 4 years. This funding makes ICE the highest and largest funded law enforcement agency in the federal government. And of note, ICE's annual budget is now higher than the military spending of many countries, including Iran and Turkey. Overall, isolating ICE's budget would make it among the top 20 most funded militaries in the world. I would argue that ICE isn't really a police force, and that Trump is really using ICE more like a paramilitary force, which is a classic thing that fascist governments do. Minneapolis is the most recent example of Trump's deployment of ICE into blue states. And I think it's really important to realize that Trump is not targeting states with the highest level of illegal immigrants. If that were true, he would deploy ICE to Texas first, but he's not. Rather, he's deploying ICE into blue states in order to essentially attack his political enemies and to fight against his political opponents. Now, I do want to note here that while I'm talking about national security, and obviously a country cannot exist without some sort of national security policy and deployment of the military in certain circumstances, but I do think that Trump is right in one way, in the sense that the United States has subsidized Europe and much of the free world through our defense spending. The problem is that he's going about fixing that problem the wrong way. The right way to address the problem is to maintain diplomacy and support our allies. But while we support our allies, we can negotiate increased defense spending by other countries, which corresponds with reduced spending by the United States. But Trump's rhetoric and his implementation of the military has shown a complete abandonment of our allies. And of course, even though Trump has criticized Europe for not taking a stronger responsibility for their own defense, he's not reducing military funding. Instead, he's increased it to record levels. In addition, rather than just making widespread across-the-board cuts, military funding and funding to national defense ought to be targeted based on the threats that the United States and the world faces. A perfect example of this is the Russian-Ukraine war. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. And I want to be clear that Putin is a fascist, and that Russia today is only a democracy in name only. I think it's interesting that Trump tends to praise authoritarian leaders, including Putin, but he's also praised authoritarian leaders in North Korea and even communist leaders in China. Trump's policy on Ukraine has essentially been pro-Russia. In fact, in 2025, Trump called for a ceasefire without committing any military funding to Ukraine. And again, calling for a ceasefire without funding military operations in Ukraine or to support Ukraine is essentially ceding Ukrainian territory to Russia. And this matches with Trump's rhetoric that supports Russia. In February 2025, Trump and Vance met with Ukrainian President Zelensky. And during this meeting, Vance spoke up to criticize former President Joe Biden and to laud Trump for seeking a diplomatic solution to the war. Now, I think we would all agree that having a diplomatically led peace to end the Ukraine and Russian war would be a good thing. But Zelensky responded to Vance with a very important caveat, in that his view was that Russia was untrustworthy. Zelensky said, "What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?" Vance responded, "I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country. Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office to try to litigate this in front of the American media." Trump then accused Zelensky of deliberately not seeking peace in favor of another world war, while Zelensky suggested the US would feel it in the future. Trump eventually ordered Zelensky out of the White House, canceling a lunch and a press conference. And so to close, I think that Trump's interactions with Ukraine and Russia really signal a different prioritization for the United States and its national security, in the sense that Trump would rather support an authoritarian country like Russia over our close allies, democratic allies, Ukraine being one of them, but many other democratic allies within Europe. So I've talked about 3 additional traits that are common to fascist governments, but now I want to move on and talk about why people support authoritarians from a psychological perspective. Some of the most oppressive regimes in history didn't just rise through force alone. They were supported by millions of ordinary people. But who does support them? Psychology has deemed some people have an authoritarian personality. The common traits include authoritarian submission. So this is essentially people's desire to obey strong, powerful leaders, especially if they're from the in-group. The second part of authoritarian personality is authoritarian aggression. This is, in essence, a desire to punish the rule breakers. And I like to compare this to what I think is a pretty normal reaction to people who violate moral codes. If you talk about a pedophile, most people's visceral reaction is that that person should be either in jail or dead. And so this authoritarian aggression expands that natural aggression to other people that would do harm in society, to anyone that would violate the rules. And then finally, conventionalism. And this essentially means sticking to traditions no matter what, regardless of what the consequences are. I'll use an example of something that's not really relevant to our modern world to try to get a deeper understanding. In the ancient Aztec world, human sacrifice was a part of their society. And so someone who has high conventionalism would have supported continuing human sacrifices despite the fact that innocent people were being killed. It wouldn't matter because that's what the conventional thinking was. The same thing can be said about positive aspects of a society or culture. The first thing that comes to mind for me is in Appalachia. People will feed each other. If you're hungry, you're going to be fed, and it doesn't matter how poor you are, you're going to make sure that your friends and neighbors have enough to eat. If you're a conventionalist, or you have high conventionalism from a personality perspective, then that's a very good thing. And so all 3 of these aspects, they all make up what is known as the authoritarian personality. And psychologists say that this personality has a genetic component. But I think it's important to keep in mind that genes are not destiny. And it makes sense why this trait would form a core part of humanity, especially if you think back to the early days of humanity before cities or even agriculture existed. It would be extremely important to be loyal to your local leaders and to punish opponents because it meant the survival of a small tribe. And if you're more likely to survive, you're more likely to be able to have children, pass on your genes, and your small tribe continues to exist. Whereas if you're more passive or have less of this authoritarian personality, you might be killed by an enemy tribe because you're quote unquote too nice. There's also an environmental aspect to authoritarian personality. And when I'm talking about environment, I'm talking about the way someone grew up, so their family life, but also the broader culture and world that they grew up in. If someone learns that the world is a dangerous place, they're far more likely to have an authoritarian personality. Why is this? Because a strong authoritarian leader signals that they can provide a safe and secure world. And hopefully it's common knowledge, but at a high level, authoritarianism is far better than anarchy because at least under authoritarianism, there's governmental support to promote a functioning society. There's not that many great examples of anarchy in the real world, but I think that Somalia is the closest example that you could get of that, where there's no functioning government group and therefore people's lives are much shorter than average and violence is far more common than it would be under an authoritarian state. Obviously, authoritarians tend to commit violence against their own people, but it's much less than compared to an anarchy state of living. There's a concept in psychology that relates to this concept of individuals feeling unsafe and unsecure, and that term is anime, which I'm probably mispronouncing, but it's a perception that society is falling apart, that the social order is failing, that moral judgments are failing, and that institutions are failing, and as a result, individuals feel lost, unsecure, and unsure in a dangerous world. This feeling also leads to feelings and thoughts that there's nothing you can do politically, that no matter what you do or what you say, you're not being represented by your leaders, which in turn leads to strong support for individual authoritarian leaders. In essence, the authoritarian leader promises to listen to you, to fix the problems that are being ignored by other leaders. They're going to prefer leaders who are decisive and strong, even if that means that you lose out on democratic principles and norms. Moving on, I want to talk about a pretty famous experiment that was run after World War II, and psychologists were essentially trying to understand, why did the Holocaust happen? How did ordinary people sit by and watch as millions of people were murdered by their governments? And so there was a psychologist at Milgram, decided to do an experiment. In that experiment, he had an authority figure dressed as a formal scientist who essentially told study participants to ask questions to other people, and if those people answered those questions incorrectly, the test subject was to administer a shock. And as the experiment continued, and as people continued to give incorrect answers, those shocks would escalate. Now, this wasn't real. The person supposedly getting the shocks would act as if the shocks were progressively getting worse. Of all the participants in this study, 83% administered what they thought were painful and eventually deadly shocks when prompted by the scientist who was posing as an authority figure. That shocked the world, but it proved that having an authority figure really influences the behavior of people, because people are naturally desiring to follow an authoritarian or a leader who probably knows better than them. There were several follow-up experiments to the Milgram experiment that answered additional questions about how people are able to follow authoritarian leaders, and there's three major factors that play a role in how willing people are to follow authority figures. The first is limited information. If you're in a new situation and you don't know anything about the situation, your tendency is to rely on an authority figure. Now, this makes sense because if you don't know, it's better to trust experts or people who proclaim to know, because you could do a lot of damage if you just willy-nilly do something that you have zero knowledge about. Imagine, and this is an extreme example, if you, as an average person, walked into the hospital and all of a sudden decided to start performing surgeries. People would die. And so from a societal perspective, it's better to trust people who proclaim to have their own expertise about individual aspects of knowledge and of society. And that's a major reason why authoritarianism relies on control of information and even promoting deceptive information to the public. Because if you don't know the facts, human tendency is to trust what authoritarians are saying, even if what the authoritarian leaders are doing is lying or manipulating people in order to think a certain way in order to promote their own regime. The second aspect that increases likelihood of people supporting or doing immoral things due to an authority figure telling them to do them is by slowly increasing the demands over time. I want to talk about the parable of the frog in a boiling pot of water. Now, full disclosure, this is actually a myth. It is just a parable, but it does fit. So, keeping that in mind, the way the parable goes is that if you put a frog into room temperature water everything is the same as if it were swimming in a pond outside. It's just that it's in this huge pot. It will happily swim away. And if you slowly, gradually increase the heat of this water and continuing until the pot of water starts to boil, the frog will continue to swim until it dies. And the same thing is true with human psychology and individual tendencies. We tolerate a lot, and we would immediately fight back if authoritarians instantly started rounding up people, killing them, reducing freedom, taking actions against ethnic, religious, and other minority groups that we don't like. People would be much more quick to react. But if an authoritarian leader does so gradually, people are far more likely to accept that the actions of an authoritarian leader is, in fact, a normal part of everyday life. And I think this is the major reason why Trump tests out many of his authoritarian-leaning ideas through tweets and through social media, because he's able to test the waters, to see the reaction of the people who are paying attention. And it, in turn, shapes what policies or what laws he supports and the actions he takes as president. And we see this as his actions have steadily, increasingly gotten closer and closer to full fascism. A third factor that influences people to follow authority figures is the tendency to avoid personal responsibility. In other words, it's very easy to cede personal moral decision-making to an authority figure. Now, we've all heard the common defense of, I was just following orders. And from a legal perspective, this isn't a valid defense. But it's still a way that people distance themselves from immoral actions. So there's another factor that influences people's tendency to follow authoritarian leaders, and that's fear. And I've kind of alluded to this, but I want to talk about why fear plays such a major driving role in people's tendencies in supporting authority figures. Now, there's something called the amygdala, and that part of a person's brain is essentially in charge of fear and stress response. And this part of the brain tends to override the logical portion of the brain. And so fear and stress are an extremely strong motivator. If someone is stressed, fears for their lives, for their children, for their families, for the society, the amygdala is going to override all logical ways of thinking, and the brain's main priority is going to be, how do I protect my family, my children, etc. And so authoritarians manipulate people using this tendency. If they can stir up people to fear others, to fear for their safety, then it's far more easy to implement authoritarian policies that hurt everyday people, because they're able to shift the focus of a society on the things that they should be fearful of, rather than logically having a calm discussion about the issues at hand. I'm sure that politicians in a democratic society, from the both left wings and right wings of the political perspective, use this strategy to manipulate people rather than having a fair debate about the issues. So to sum up, there are several psychological factors that influences people's tendencies to follow authoritarian regimes. And in fact, I would wager that based on the psychological research, the majority of people would support authority and authoritarian regimes first before they supported democracy. And so it's something that we actively have to educate people about in order to make sure that they understand what's happening and are able to actively and logically think about why democracy is better for the world and for their country and society. That wraps up the third episode of Preserving the Republic, a dialogue. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned as I continue to explore the forces that preserve or threaten our republic.